has made it from North London through St Pancras to here, getting up at 1:30 hour in order to be with us, having done the news last night, Channel 4 News, and doing it again tonight. So it's, we're very, very grateful to him for making such an effort. And although we never use cliches in this department, and certainly never had one from me in the introductory role, I think I'll say today that John needs an introduction before introducing him. He's been presenting Channel 4 News for 1989, I believe, it started, and that means that many of you would be sort of pre-weaned on John, or weaned on John. But there he is, he's probably the best known anchor in this country. He's done a lot of work overseas, he's worked in Washington, he's covered elections, he's hosted the election campaign here. He's won 3 of the Premier Presenter Awards, what's it, the Royal Television Society Award 3 times, and on it goes. It's a great honour to have him here, and we shall throw it over to him to talk about I Know Not What, and then to take those of your questions. We'll leave plenty of time for that. I'll just do what's allowed 40 minutes or so. John, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter. And of course, need to say the microphone falls off immediately. Hang on. It's a great honour to be introduced by Peter. You know, I mean, he is, you know, one of the great operatives of the golden age of print journalism, and I'm going to talk to you today about the golden age that we're all entering, and it really is a golden age, the best age ever to be becoming a journalist, unquestionably. Actually, Peter said you were probably weaned on Channel 4 News, but it's quite interesting. I don't know if anybody knows the experiment with Pavlov's dog. Pavlov's dog, every time you rang a bell, you fed the dog. And of course, if you rang the bell and didn't feed the dog still mustered plenty of saliva and slobbered and the rest of it. And quite a few nursing mothers have written to me and said that actually what happens at 7 o'clock is you get da-da-da, and that's the equivalent of Pavlov's bell. That's the moment when they feed their baby for the last feed before they put them down. So the bright colours in the television screen, ties, you know, circumstance, studios and the rest of it, kind of excite the child, and the music kind of reminds them that's the time of day. And then at the end of the news they put them to bed, and that's it. And so in fact we've got a captive audience of nursing mothers, so you can just imagine the breastfeeding that's going on and the rest of it. It's a funny moment in the day. So maybe you were breastfed in front of Channel 4 News, and that's a thought. It makes me feel that makes me feel extremely old. No, I do want to talk to you about the golden age, because I don't think people often realise how far we've come, how fast, and how fast we're going. I started in 1976 in television, and 1973 in radio. I still regard radio as the ultimate medium, although I don't work in it, but it is an absolutely fantastic medium, and it's come of age even in the digital age because of obviously all sorts of things like downloads and the iPlayer and the rest of it. And of course you can have the radio on while you're doing many other things. But my life has been in television, and when I started there was no video, effectively no video. A video was carried around on great spools that took often 2 men to lift and then plonked onto a machine, and the video was edited by hand with a razor blade, and you cut it on what was called the slant. And to this day, if you edit in the United States, you edit in a room which is called slant. And nobody knows why it's called slant, but I know why it's called slant, because the videotape was spliced on the slant. And we were on film, and film was 16 millimeter, and it had integrated sound, which was regarded as a huge breakthrough because the sound was on stripe along the side of the film. We didn't have double system where you had picture and sound on separate systems. And it was very, very cumbersome, and you had to allow in your working day 2 hours minimum, maybe 3 hours, to have it bathed in chemicals to process it, and only then could you start editing it. So if you were working for a 6 o'clock news bulletin, you had to be done and dusted. Basically, you couldn't shoot anything after about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So news only happened in the morning if you were working in television. That's domestically. And then imagine if you were working abroad. I mean, I worked initially in Africa a lot, in East Africa, and I was sort of semi-based in Nairobi, and you were dependent then not only just on the period of time that it was going to take to process the film, but that processing would occur in London, and you had to get the film to London, and there were no satellites. And you imagine that in 1976, 77, 78, really only 40 years ago, there were no satellites, virtually no satellites. There was one over the Atlantic and one over the Indian Ocean. And if you couldn't get onto them, you couldn't transmit. And in any case, if you couldn't process the film, which you couldn't process in Africa, there was very little processing and almost no access at all to any satellite, you couldn't film a story in the same day. You couldn't, and very often it would take perhaps 3 days to get a story you'd shot back to Britain for transmission. And then it was regarded as news because nobody else had managed to do it any quicker. So the whole idea of the kind of instant and live and all the rest of it, which we completely take for granted now, was virtually impossible. You could do live as long as you were in Britain, or conceivably in New York or Washington, but the satellites that existed entirely favoured the northern world. There was no coverage of the south at all. It would be completely impossible to talk to Australia in a day, completely impossible to talk to Cape Town, absolutely impossible to cover anything in Egypt. If we'd had an Arab Spring, it would have taken us 3 days to get it to you, or 2 days at least. And it's almost impossible to imagine that we took that absolutely for granted. So, but on the other hand, in some ways it made us better journalists because we had to work harder to find out information. And the information we found out had to be more or less first-hand. No reference to Google, no chance to find out from the equipment you had with you what on earth was going on. No phones in many of the places where you were working. So you were very, very dependent on eyewitness accounts of what you were seeing. And you had to work incredibly hard to get anywhere where you could see anything or find anybody who had seen anything. So the whole idea of news and current affairs was completely different. And you know, the journey has been extraordinarily complex. You know, if I take, for example, the overthrow of Idi Amin in Uganda in 1978 or so, you know, every morning we would get up and we would go down the road to see how far the Tanzanian army who'd come in to overthrow him had got, and Amin's war front would move off nearer and nearer to oblivion, somewhere down towards the Kenyan border. And you would go down and you would film as much as you could, and then you'd have to be back in time to catch the British Airways plane going back to London. And what would happen was you would stay throughout the morning at the shoulder of your cameraman, because obviously you would never see the pictures. You would only see what the cameraman was shooting. So you'd look over his shoulder and you'd have a notebook, and every shot, did you get that dog running across the road? Did you see that guy in the helmet? Did you see the body? Don't go too close on it, because we won't be able to transmit it. Keep it wide, so keep just face down in the mud. That'll do. That's one of Amin's soldiers dead in the water. And you'd make a note: body dead, water. And then you'd carry on, and there'd be a tank moving further up the road. A lot of dust flying off the road, and tank, dust flying, and you'd make these very, very detailed notes of everything that happened. And then when you got back to your hotel, of course you couldn't see the pictures. You would have to write something which would work with the pictures you'd seen, and you'd write in 2 columns. Every script paper was divided into 2. The script was on one side and the pictures were on the other. And you would say, the ragbag army that still accompanies Amin is falling to pieces, and there would be, the body in the marsh. And the Tanzanians have still got tanks moving forward, dust flying, the rest of it. And you'd try to keep the words to a minimum, but try to pin them very hard to the pictures so that it really felt in some way immediate. And it was an extraordinary skill, because what would happen would be that would then be boxed up. You go down to the plane. If you shipped it through customs and on the cargo, it was going to take at least another day to get it out of Heathrow. So you had to try and find somebody to bribe. And you would look around, you'd look at the passengers. You'd never really try women, because they would think, you were up to no good. So you'd try men, and you'd say, look, would you mind carrying this to London? And of course, it was pre-terrorism, so pre that kind of terrorism. And so nobody sort of thought you were trying to give them a bomb. They just thought you were odd. So you'd say, do you mind if you take this to London? It's film, and you can't open it. I can't show the contents, unfortunately, because if you did, it would expose it all. And so the person would either say yes, or they'd say fuck off, So then you'd say, look, what about $25? And the guy would say, well, I'll do it for 50. So you'd have to pay $50 to the passenger to carry the film, and then you'd have to arrange with somebody in London. And how would you do that without a telephone? Well, I'll tell you in a moment. But you'd have to arrange with somebody in London to meet this person. So you'd have to make a note of what they looked like. Red-haired, scraggy beard, rather short, dishevelled, not very well-dressed jeans. And you'd go back down to the hotel switchboard and you'd say to them, could I use the telex? Well, nobody knows what a telex is now, but in those days you could type on a telex, which would make a tape with holes in it. And it would somehow transmit itself back to London, and it would come out as text in London. It was very slow, but you could say, man on BA, red hair, scraggy beard, bad dressed, have paid $50, has package. And then they'd go to the airport and they'd look for this miserable chap coming out of, and sometimes the thing went missing, and days of work was lost. And but 3 days after you shot it, rather a nice report would end up on News at 10. And the editor would have had to slave over his Steenbeck, his twin-wheeled film editing thing, having got it out of the chemical bath. And he'd peer over your script, which would often not be even typewritten, because you were somewhere where you hadn't even got a portable typewriter. And the guy would look at the script, and it would say, body in marsh, and he'd look at it. And sometimes these editors were butchers, and sometimes they were artists. The butchers would say, that lasts 3 seconds, because you count 1 second for every 3 words. So I've written 9 words, so that's 3 seconds. So he'd just go like this, and that is 3 seconds. From there to here is 3 seconds. He'd just slash it and chuck it on. But the more skilled ones would shovel around and try and wiggle with the wheels and the rest of it, and just make it perfect. But it would all be manual. It's just so incredible to think of this. I don't want to dwell on it, but I have, because I want you to know how difficult it was to work in television in those days. People like Peter had a better deal of it, because they could do more with their typewriters and with either reading the script over or telexing it. I mean, it could be done. But television was a real struggle. And of course, the result was that in many cases, a lot of stories just didn't get covered. It just wasn't worth trying. And there was no guarantee, if you sent anybody, that they'd ever manage to get anything back. So it was only very, very big stories which tended to get covered. Well, then the glorious thing of video appeared, and suddenly you were able to actually look at the material, and you didn't have to bath it. And so by kind of, I don't know, but I think 1980 was the first time that I ever used video. 1980, where are we now? 2012, that's 32 years ago. It's a pretty amazing thing to think that we've only had video, for really accessible video. And even then they were very big cassettes. I mean, they were that size. I mean, nothing mini, nothing like that. They were this. And so you could see what you'd done, and you could edit it, but it was incredibly cumbersome. And if you were in a war zone, the cameraman was carrying an enormous beast of a camera, far bigger than anything you see now. Some of them were emitting cancerous rays, and there are quite a few of the cameramen that I worked with have died since then of brain cancer. I say quite a few, but certainly 2 out of about a dozen. And the cameras had huge umbilical cords to a vast recording box. And if you imagine running about trying to avoid, trouble, it was very difficult. So there was there was the man with the big box, there was the umbilical cord, there was the camera, and there was the sniper. And it wasn't a good combination. So for a long time we actually stayed with film because it was so much lighter, even though it was so difficult. And I worked a lot in Central America on the Civil War in El Salvador and in Nicaragua and the revolution and the rest of it. And so we were still shipping material, but usually there was nobody else there. That was a great thing. There was very little other television there, so you had it to yourself. So you were still making kind of exclusives and the rest of it. And I think the first foreign trip I went on was with the Pope in Poland. And being a Polish Pope, going to Poland, where Catholicism is, a way of life, or was, because it was the only alternative way of life to communism. Of course, millions of people turned out, so it was a fantastic picture, and video really came of age in that moment. What we didn't realize was, of course, that video decomposed, that actually some of the most important stories in the early 80s began to fall apart, and that actually retrieving material from that era, from sort of 1980 to 1990, is very difficult. And that has not been transferred onto other systems has begun to perish. But again, we were very short of links back to base. But the good thing about that period in Europe was that Eurovision was invented, and that meant that countries would share links with each other, and it was possible to bounce stuff from Poland into Germany, and Germany into France, and France into Britain. So it would come back here looking pretty grey, but it would get here on the same day, and you could do live. And so by the time, for example, that the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and now we're talking only 23 years ago, by then it was possible to do live transmissions, and I did the news live from the Berlin Wall the day the wall came down. My colleague in those days, a guy called Nick Gowing, who operates on BBC World, was on the other side of the wall, and unfortunately he was on what we call a mini micro dish, and it was the first time we'd ever tried these portable dishes that you could bounce stuff from one area to another truck. And unfortunately he was upside down, and they never managed to correct the signal. I don't know why he was upside down. We had this debate. Is this so momentous a moment that we can afford to take our correspondent upside down, or should we just abandon it? I think we did take him briefly upside down because it was so important to hear from the other side of the wall. And then, you remember how bad your journalism was in those days. I mean, how bad my journalism was. I remember walking down the Unter den Linden, which is this big sweep going down to the Brandenburg Gate on the eastern side, and saying to my cameraman, do you realize, old chap, within 10 years, these two countries, East and West Germany, could be one country. Within 6 weeks they were. I mean, I was 10 years out. And of course, even then, we still didn't have access to really instant alternative information. You were really still dependent on retrieving the material yourself, finding out for yourself what was going on. There was no mechanism for Googling it. Or that's that moment again, when the magnet goes. But you don't need to get up, because I've still got the clip. I've got the microphone. In fact, this is a deliberate thing. I'm just testing it out so that when I say something which shouldn't really go out on the web, I can censor it by pulling the magnet, and then only you will hear it. Because this is the problem, of course. We're living now in an age in which anything I say will be taken down and used in evidence against me. And my policewoman, my minder back at Channel 4 News, who's really our press officer, but is very mindful of what I say, will say, did you tell me you were going to talk to university students at Sheffield? Did you tell me you were going to talk to the journalism course? And did you tell me what content you were going to talk about? Should you really have said that? All that, that sort of thing. But anyway, I digress. Anyway, now you see, when I talk about the golden age of journalism, when I talk about the dark age that I've been through, or we have been through, in terms of communications and the difficulty posed by the technology and the absence of it, you can see that maybe you are poised on the threshold of the greatest age journalism has ever known. We've never had so much information to play with as we have now. We've got this moment where we are actually overwhelmed with what we can do. The slight problem is we may not get paid for it, and that is a big problem. It'd be the golden age of journalism, but not the golden age of salary and income. No, not yet, but it will become so. We just have to sort it out. I mean, in a way, we're poised on the edge of a deep ravine. And actually, I like to think about it in a better way than that. There's a fantastic documentary called Man on Wire. Has anyone here ever seen Man on Wire? If you haven't seen it, you need to see it, because it's about us. Man on Wire is about a completely loony tightrope walker. He's French, and he lives in the French countryside, and he decides he's going to tightrope walk between the Twin Towers. This, of course, is before they've been brought down by Al-Qaeda. So he's going to walk between the two towers in New York. He's never been to New York. He's never seen the Twin Towers. He has no idea how he's going to do it, but he decides he's going to do it. And the film basically tracks this ludicrous character who is very good at tightrope walking. There's no mistake about that, but he's not organizationally very hot. At any rate, he arrives in New York, and he has accomplices. But he has no idea how he's going to get the wire up the building without being spotted, i.e. the tightrope. And he has no idea how he's going to get it from one building to the other. There are these two extraordinary towers, which I suppose were certainly at least 100 feet apart, probably more, and were, of course, at least 30 floors high, probably more. But somehow they do get the wire up the building, and somehow they do get the wire across, and somehow he does find himself on the tightrope, looking down on mesmerized faces in the streets below. And they look up and they see him. The amazing thing is he's so inefficient, he doesn't take a moving camera with him, so there are only stills of him actually on the wire. But fun enough, when you see the film, although they fake nothing, you're unaware that you haven't actually seen him move. You've seen him lie down on the wire, you've seen him on one foot on the wire, you've seen him on the other foot on the wire, you've seen him with his hands above his head, but you've never actually seen him move. But you do see a series of not a brilliant system. I'm going to come up with a better system. What I'm going to do is stuff it through the hole here, and then that's it. You can still hear me. See, old technology sometimes. This is very impressive. It's a magnet and the rest of it. I thought, why don't we have those things? And now I know. But seriously, the reason I tell you the story of Man on Wire is that the two buildings represent the world we're in. There is old media in this building, which is us, the BBC, the Guardian, the FT, the printed word. And in the other building, there is Google, there is digital, there is life, there is connectivity, there is Twitter, there is everything. But they are completely dependent on us, and we are completely dependent upon them. They have the means of transmission, we have the information. And in the end, everything that was ever said about the internet is about content, content, content. And the more valuable the content, the more valuable you are. And what you have to look for is originality of content. You have to be the first to find the information that the provider is keen to transmit. And this is a fantastic potential and very great fertile relationship. But we haven't found a way to enable ourselves to have the kind of relationship with the provider that will enable us to live and pay our way. They still get it for free. The Guardian is completely free and is losing 50 million a year. We are completely free. We aren't losing 50 million a year yet, but we cost a lot. We're very expensive. So how's this going to be married? And I don't really know the answer, except that I know that the better the content, there is no question, the better the content, the more chance there is of realizing a monetary value. And that brings me, I think, to the most important thing about what we can do, particularly those of us who are broadcast journalists. And that is, we have to forget the fantastic technical capacity that you have. And I know most people here probably can do things which I can't do. I can't edit on digital. I can't physically edit anything. I could shoot something and have shot things in the past when things have got particularly desperate. My cameraman had heat exhaustion in Somalia once when we were up on the front line in the war in the Ogaden. And he collapsed. He was an Italian, and he'd had a very Italian collapse, so it was quite extravagant. And we parked him under a very unextravagant tree. And there was me left with his brother, who was the sound man, who absolutely refused to take the camera. So I took the camera. This was a film camera, and it was very heavy, and we went up to the front line, and we were with one other guy from TF1, from French television. And he shouted exposures at me, F1, Jean. And I sort of, fine, yes, F1, right. So I was able to sort of sort that out. And he said, no, keep it wide, don't go tight, don't zoom, keep still. So I had the camera like this, wide, and then, of course, a machine gun nest would open up, then it would go like that, and your hand would go like that, and the camera went like that. But gradually, I kind of settled down and shot it. And when I got it back to ITN, there was a trade union dispute over it, and it was blacked because I wasn't a member of the ACCT, which was the union which was responsible for camera work. But we did eventually get a few frames on, but it was a painful experience. But I am not, therefore, a technician. Many of you know how to edit, know how to shoot, and the rest of it. But that is actually much less important than knowing how to write. Writing is the essence of everything we do, and not enough people understand it. The beauty of television is the spoken word. People remember perhaps only 10% of what they hear on television, and perhaps 80% of what they see. So what you say in that small moment of chance is incredibly important, and has to be something which adds to that picture, which tells 1,000 words. Some of the writing on television nowadays is pretty awful, because it's very much the last thing in the job. You don't really think about it as much as you think about how to edit the story physically, because that is a taxing operation. And consequently, the value of the written word in television has, I think, gone down. The other day, and I'll give you this illustration, I was in New Jersey, And we hired a helicopter actually we were in Baltimore to start with, and we hired a helicopter, the most expensive helicopter I've ever had. It was an extremely posh helicopter. It was driven by jet, the things had, somehow there was a jet relationship to the rotors. I can't explain what it was, but it was there. And it was fast, and it was very nicely appointed. And I had one of the best cameramen I've ever worked with on board. And we flew up to Atlantic City, where all the evidence was and all the word was that it was devastated and terrible and all the rest of it, and Trump has all his stuff there, and I thought, it'd be great to see, look at Trump Towers and see it trashed and the rest of it, but no. Anyway, we flew, and when we got there, we filmed and we filmed and we filmed. And it was an amazing, the sea was heavy and the streets were deserted, but the town essentially was in one piece, and Trump Towers was still standing tall, funny hair pieces on top, but all fine, all natural, grown in, no question of doctoring. They looked very nice. And, well, not so nice, but they were there. And when we got back and landed, my producer was in tears, and she said, "John, we've really screwed it. We've spent $6,000 and we've got nothing." I said, "We've got an absolute dream. We've seen something so important." And the value of the piece was in the words just as much as in the helicopter shot. I interviewed nobody. There were no voices other than mine, no pictures other than my cameraman's. We could introduce no pictures from anybody else because nobody else had been there. But what we looked down upon was a beautiful example of how some 35,000 people had been saved from the ravages of the hurricane of Sandy. They had managed to evacuate this complex place and take everybody to safety. And the pictures enabled us to tell this dramatic story of how the population of this town had been saved. The town itself had kind of stood up. Of course, there was damage. The boardwalk had gone and the rest of it. But it wasn't dramatically trashed. So the story was not in wreckage, but in survival. And in spotting that and being able to turn it around and write it and use the pictures, it was extraordinary because people called up and said, "That was such a lovely piece." And the producer just couldn't believe it, that we had somehow managed to rescue from the ashes of this hopeless trip in this helicopter, in which we'd seen no evidence of death or mass destruction, how we'd managed to get a piece which stood up and sort of kind of won the day on the news that night. So I can't emphasize too strongly how important what we say and our use of words is, and it is the forgotten element now of broadcast journalism. So here we are in this golden age, and the golden age is fueled by the instant which eluded us in the 1970s, in which we had no option to do anything instant, anything live, anything now. And what we have now is the social network, is the web. And I would argue, actually, the great facility we have now is Twitter. I am an absolutely unreconstructed fan of Twitter, because Twitter is not about 140 characters. It has nothing to do with 140 characters. Thank God you can't say more, because the great brilliance of Twitter is links. Links to pictures, links to articles, links to long-form journalism, links to jokes, links to photographs. It's a really fantastic device for leading people to water. It is the first journalistic facility which enables us to spread the word in a completely sort of global way without any interference by any third party. It is a most extraordinary device. I mean, I was coming back from the hurricane in Haiti, and I read a piece in the Wall Street Journal which explained why aid to Haiti was failing. And it was a really well thought out piece, despite being a Murdoch publication. And it really was a very, very good piece. And all I did was to tweet, if you want to know why aid is failing, read this. Monk. And there's Twitter, bitlinking the URL, so you're not wasting 400 characters in sending the URL. It's down to 8 or 10 or whatever it is. Doesn't sap your 140 characters. You can say whatever you like. And of course it runs from the absurd to the very deepest possible communication. The absurd, this morning I tweeted two things. One I thought of great significance, which was from Syria. It was a government website which claimed to have supplied the United Nations with the names of 142 foreign fighters who they had picked up amongst the dead bodies of Syrians in their country. 47 Saudis, 11 Qataris, 6 Qataris and 11 Libyans. Kind of tells you quite a lot about the jihadists who are going into Syria. It may not be true. You have to say that is the Syrian government claiming that, but it's a very interesting thing. So I tweeted that, and then I tweeted the fact that I'd played the piano on St Pancras Station Concourse. Now, I've been wanting to play the piano on St Pancras Concourse for a long time. I often go to St Pancras, have to go on the Eurostar or whatever, but the piano is always occupied. And there are two pianos, and they're usually occupied by really fantastic performers. Anyway, this morning there was nobody around, so I stole onto the piano in my bilious yellow cycle jacket, hoping not to be noticed. And I played for about 5 minutes, and then I tweeted that I had unleashed 5 minutes on the piano this morning, and hoped that I'd got away with it. And I think I did, because there was nothing followed it on YouTube, but be assured if somebody had caught it on a camera, they would have done. But as I came off the train, the man said to me, I missed you on the piano in St Pancras. I said, why, were you there? Yes, he said, I caught the same train. I've been following you on Twitter. I mean, shit, there was somebody in the same train, on the same, having the same experience, all the rest of it. That's a lovely thing, People don't speak to each other on trains. I actually do speak to people on trains. Trains are a very fertile place to pick up serious journalistic bits and pieces. The last train I took, I was with two deaf people. We were on a table of four, and this is journalism. Journalism is so serendipitous. The table of four, you know how you get it, a table of four? Two deaf people. One could not speak, the other had speech, and the one here turned to me and went, and the one there said, he doesn't speak, but he can sign language and the rest of it. And we started to sort of talk, she could lip read. And then I thought, I've got my Mac Air here. I'll go into 24 point and I'll start asking questions on my laptop. So I was able to talk to him through my laptop. He could read, and then he would say, he would answer through her. So we had this triangular conversation. And I discovered that they were both victims of meningitis. They were in their 60s, but each had contracted it, one at 5 and one at 6. One had lost speech and hearing, the other had lost hearing. And then on the one here turned out to be a Mongolian economist from Warwick University. And suddenly I was having conversations about deafness, disability, attitudes, China, how it is to be Mongolian against a Chinese superpower, what it's like to be at Warwick University as an economist, how she saw the world in economic terms and the rest of it. And now there was no story here, but there was information which would provide for me at another time. Subsequent to that, it wasn't the last rail trip I took, it was a bit longer ago than that, but subsequent to that, I got charged with having to work on the Paralympics. And the deaf choir sang, and I thought of these two people and what they'd told me about deafness and music and the rest of it. And I had material from my conversation with these two people, which played 3 years later into my work on the Paralympics. That's journalism. That's retrieving material from every possible moment that you have. It's not an irksome thing, it's a thing about curiosity, inquisitiveness. I think the best journalists are bound to be inquisitive, bound to be asking questions, and bound to be talking to people. People don't talk to each other enough. Actually, some journalists can be very boring, alleviated enormously by talking to people and finding out who they are and what they do and where they come from. In our incredibly multicultural and diverse society, finding out where people come from is an incredible thing. On Monday, I went to Oxford because I sit on a board there at the Ashmolean Museum. And I was on the train with a Greek. She was a Greek doctor, and her husband was a Greek doctor. And they were both doing different things in the National Health Service, and she was doing research at Oxford into diabetes. And suddenly I was able to talk about both Greece and diabetes, two huge issues of our time. Diabetes, I was in Qatar 2 weeks ago. 20% of Qataris are diabetic. That's an incredible statistic, 20%. And 60% of the people living in Qatar are obese. That's an incredible statistic. So I was able to talk to her about that and learn more about why that might be. And she talked to me about what it was like to be Greek and how her parents had each suffered a 50% cut in their pensions. Suddenly you have intimate access to something which has only been available to you rather generally. I mean, I did cover the Greek elections in Athens, but I didn't talk to anybody about pensions. You know, so here is this holistic world in which we live, in which so many of us have become separated because we've got our earphones in and we are at our little terminals in our phones, on our laptops, whatever. We have to talk. So I'm urging a twofold assault on words. One, the words we write in our reports. Two, the words we exchange with each other. Real words, verbal, three-dimensional words, not words just transmitted through the phone or the laptop in the written or the sound form. It is a really, really exciting time to be alive, to be a journalist, to be a trainee journalist, to be looking to the future, because we'll get it in order. At the moment we're completely bombarded, overwhelmed. How do we use all these devices and the rest of it? How do we harness it to become ace communicators who will pick up a salary, pick up an income, pick up a life, and become, you know, people who shape the society in which we live? Because we have influence. You know, once upon a time, when I was 15, I wanted to be a Tory MP. I'd had a very sheltered upbringing. And then I realized that I was better at talking about it than doing it, and so eventually I went for journalism. And now, the truth is that journalists have more power than backbench politicians. If you want to influence the way the world evolves, if you want to change the world, journalism is the route through which you do it. Not prejudice journalism, but truth journalism. Sometimes, you know, prejudice, well, all of us have prejudices. You know, there is nothing neutral about journalism. You're a woman, I'm a man. You know, we will see things differently. And we need to report them differently. And that's why we need diversity in journalism. Channel 4 News has signed up to the Broadcast Magazine commitment to try to expand the number of women experts on television. There's a very good piece in the Guardian G2 today about women and the media, because the fact of the matter is that although women operatives have expanded greatly in the media, the truth is the media still highlights the words of men more than women. Of course, what's interesting about television is you ring up an economist, a woman economist, and you say, we want to talk tonight about the public sector borrowing deficit. And she will say, well, public sector borrowing requirement, yes. It's something I've written about, and I certainly know something about it, but it's not my thing, you know, that's not my real specialty. And to be honest, no, I don't think I'll come on, thanks. And you ring the man, and he will say, the male economist, public sector borrowing requirement, not really my thing, but I've written about it, of course I know about it. What time do you want me? And, you know, that is the difference between men and women. Men favour bullshit. Women less so. That's a fact, it's an inescapable fact. We can't do anything about it. Maybe as life evolves, women will indulge in more bullshit. But basically, men are into bullshit. And we've got to get less bullshit on the air. And that's why you're where you are. And that's why you have a better chance of making it in our brave new world, in our fantastic golden age of journalism, than anybody else. And you're at Sheffield, which is a pretty hot place. So I'm very grateful to you for indulging me with your ears. I'm now open to your questions. Fortunately, there aren't any, so that's great. Should we go and have coffee? By the way, I'm incredibly impressed with the number of people who got in here at 9:30 in the morning. In my day, we would never have been here, so, especially if anyone as boring as me turned out. No questions, isn't that great? Or no points, perhaps you'd like to argue with me too. Yeah, go for it.
I think a year or two back you were kind of criticised for saying about Prince Harry going into active service in Afghanistan.
You want to get me into trouble?
No, So basically, there was a media blackout, supposedly, of reporting Prince Harry going to service in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And the media kind of respected it, but you were kind of outspoken when the story came out about you didn't think the media should have respected that blackout, so why?
Well, this was a very micro story, but which of course was made into a macro issue. There is a convention whereby the Ministry of Defence or anything in terms of national security from the government, media does agree to accept a blackout. It could be, I don't know, a hostage situation in which some forces have been taken captive or something. But anyway, it's used in high national security moments or high moments in which the life of somebody is very seriously in danger. And the truth was that this was not one of those occasions. I mean, I'm a great fan of Harry and the rest of it, that isn't a problem. But the fact was that the fact that he'd gone to Afghanistan was not a matter of national security. It was. I could see that it might be important not to keep his presence there public, but the fact is, he went the other day and they told us immediately. So I'm afraid to say, I won. I won. The fact is, it was not needed. It didn't need to happen. And it didn't happen this time round. Sorry, you want?
No, but do you think that because he was the prince, that he would have been a target, so that could have endangered the other people that are working alongside him, the other soldiers?
Well, in a sense, that's not our problem. I mean, they have a choice as to send him or not. But it isn't. You know, the war will not be won or lost by whether any particular individual is there or not. The lives of a number of people might be won or lost in their normal action. I think. Well, I don't regret. I don't regret. Je ne regrette rien. And now I will be fired. Then it's your fault. Somebody was up there. I saw something. Green, yeah.
How can we regard radio as the ultimate medium as opposed to TV?
Well, I think the pictures are better on radio. To be honest, I think your imagination can be led on the most amazing journey on radio. I don't know if you ever listen to radio plays. They can be fantastic. People listen to them in the car sometimes, that sort of thing. Podcasts, but I think it's because it is consumable in any circumstance. You can be cooking, fishing, standing on your head, doing yoga, whatever it is, and you can still be absorbing, and that's something. You can't be watching pictures, when you're, well, if you are, you'll burn the, fish or whatever it is. I mean, I don't mean it literally, but I enjoy it most. I receive all my best information orally. I find it difficult to find the space in the day to sit down and watch the television. I know a lot of people have the television on as a background thing and pick up a lot, but they're actually picking it up orally. They're picking up most of the information from the TV orally in those circumstances where they're doing something else. It's just an amazingly adaptable, and I think sound, although I don't think people use sound in radio as well as they could, particularly in news and current affairs, although the BBC seems to be introducing more sound into their news reports, I don't think people use sound as much as they could. But sound is a tremendous provocative in the head, in the brain. Carry on, yes. Isn't it impressive? You see, all the questions are coming from women, although there are fewer men than women here, that is true.
You said about traditional forms of print media like The Guardian dying.
Do you think that the way to go with those is behind a paywall and things like that, or do you think that eventually the newspapers are just going to die out and be replaced by kind of blogs and things?
I don't think paywalls will ever really protect the mass media. You see, the only paywall that I pay to go through is the FT. Now, this is not an advertisement for the FT. It happens to be a niche newspaper that I need to read because I'm an economic illiterate. And we're living in a time when economics, unfortunately, and finance are very prevalent in the kind of work that I do. So I do pay to breach that paywall. But I don't think that that's the solution. The solution is, I think, bound to be advertising. Is bound to be, in some way, a trade between the web and the provider and advertising. Advertisers are catching up. I mean, it's coming on apace online. The question still remains, the man on wire still remains how we marry these two forces, content and provision. But I think advertising is going to always be the key. People will always want to sell something, and they'll have to pay to sell it. And in paying to sell it, they'll have to fuel the content and pay for the content. And the better the content, the better place to place your ad. It's gone on ever since the Stone Age, ever since man started chiseling OXO on the cave wall. Yeah.
You said that journalists are more influential than backbench MPs. What, in your view, is the right balance of power between journalists and politicians?
Well, that's a very complex question. The right balance of power between journalists and politicians. Well, I mean, journalists clearly have an obligation in any democracy to report the works of the politicians and the way they impinge on the community. I think the difficulty at the moment is that the politicians are behind the curve in the information age. I mean, it's a pretty amazing thing to have a parliamentary system which is almost totally inaccessible to the new age of digital communication. It's available on television, but the television only deals with very limited action. You're only allowed certain shots. You're not allowed to edit them in certain ways. So you have no way of honing in on a particular member. You have no capacity to deploy what the digital age provides, which is the possibility of asking your own access to your own MP within the House of Commons. You can ring him up, you can send him an email or her an email, but you can't see what they're up to in the House. How did they vote in that moment? Does it come up when they vote? Does it come up on a website? Can you see Arnold Scragweasel, MP for Darlington North, voted yes? Not in that instant. And you should be able to say, you should immediately be able to bang off an email and say, here, Scragweasel, why did you vote yes? I elected you to vote no. The democratic process has not in any way, I think, yet caught up with who we are and what we can do. I mean, it does seem to me quite extraordinary that MPs still troop through a lobby and are counted one by one instead of pressing a pad sitting in their seats. And the idea that they should be in a chamber that is a sword and a half from the person on the other side, that's not the digital age. We're together. We're in a great horseshoe of opportunity in which we're all equal, and many of us pine to work together to improve the world in which we live. And yet we have designed in front of us something which was set up in 1343 to enable people to argue with each other across this sword and a half's length, one from the other. That's not life. I mean, so is it any wonder that the politician and the journalist are not on an equal footing? The journalist has absolute capacity to reach out to both his or her constituents. We have more power to reach his or her constituents than the MP does. That's ridiculous. So the right balance would be for MPs to devise a mechanism for existing in a political sphere that was accessible to all. And as it doesn't, then I'm afraid at the moment the balance is out of kilter. So the balance could be redressed. But I suspect, as you're the head of the department, that what you're really trying to get me to do is to discuss Leveson. Were you?
No, I was trying to get you to write my lecture for Friday.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've talked a lot of guff. Men do bullshit. I've said that already. No, I don't particularly want to talk about Leveson. I mean, you know me, I'm completely neutral on Leveson. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because, we're in this unusual situation where on Thursday night, I will have to do some dispassionate interviews with people on both sides, and yet I'm bound to have my own personal opinion because I'm a hack, and this affects hacks. And it's an exciting moment. It's an exciting moment. Very. I had to give evidence at Leveson. That was an exciting moment. Very intimidating. Very nervous. Very difficult. Nice guy, I liked him. Actually, I liked him. That'll go down as prejudice, won't it? No, he was a nasty old chink. No.
Do you think he collected evidence from the right quarters? And was there an area that he missed collecting evidence from?
Seemed to me to go on and on. I think it was sort of long enough. I think everybody got a chance, to give him evidence. Seemed to be quite an open kind of thing. I liked that guy Jay. I thought he was quite an operative. I'd like to have been that kind of a lawyer. Unfortunately, I got thrown out before I finished my law degree. But I wouldn't have been any good anyway. I don't have the Latin. Yes?
What would you say is the pinnacle of your career so far?
Goodness, being here is one of them. I don't know. You kind of scale a pinnacle every day of your life. I mean, in terms of, getting to grips with things. I would say that it was a very long time ago. Every working year as a journalist, you think you've reached a pinnacle. And if you don't, you should sort of give up, really. I would say I see myself as a reporter more than as an anchor, and my reporting has been a lot better than my anchoring. I mentioned that I'd been sent to Central America, and in the time that I was sent to Central America, which is in the aftermath of the assassination of an archbishop, Archbishop Romero, there was no other media there. There were almost no other media there, and what we saw was something truly terrible. This was a backyard Latin American, Central American country, 5 million people, which had existed in the shadow of American influence, in which very, very terrible things were happening. The right wing had deployed death squads to kill peasant leaders who were asking for a better life. We would go to bed in the Camino Real at night at the hotel in San Salvador and wake up in the morning to find bodies laid out in the car park for our inspection of people they'd decided to assassinate overnight. You would drive down the Litoral, the coastal road, and there would be 12 corpses and their heads would be laid out neatly on the other side of the road. It was mayhem, real shit. And I feel very privileged to this day to have been somebody who was able to transmit that to a wider world. But of course, sensitivities and the rest of it's hard to show dead bodies on the television and the rest of it, but nevertheless, we got away with it. Yes?
You and the rest of the Channel 4 team have really active Twitter accounts. So I was wondering, when you're researching for the news, do you still rely on sort of traditional ways of getting the news, or does social media play an increasingly big role?
Well, social media plays a very big role in terms of trying to retrieve people's views. So it's a very good way of just throwing out, we're doing X tonight, anybody out there have any views? Or is there anybody there who knows somebody who served in Afghanistan and feels they were let down, etc. There are endless ways. I mean, it's not scientific, but you will find no worse a cross-section of people than you would by any other mechanism. So it's a fantastic way of reaching people for that kind of exercise. But I mean, I get led to stuff. I mean, the really important thing about Twitter, beyond the other things that I've mentioned, is also who you follow. I mean, I don't believe you can follow thousands of people, to be honest. You haven't really got a chance of making much sense of it. I think if you're highly selective, and I'm constantly changing the people I follow. I mean, I did follow 6 people in Bahrain, 3 on each side. Bahrain's still going on, I'm down to 1 on each side. But it ebbs and flows. I follow a couple of people in Egypt, I did follow more. It is an information source, undoubtedly, once you trust the source. I follow the New York Times, I follow the FT, I follow the Guardian, I follow the New Yorker, follow Atlantic Monthly. So there are organs that I follow, and there are people that I follow. And they're rewarding, it's true. And if they're not, I don't follow them, they go. It's a ruthless life. Yes, a man. Let's celebrate. No bullshit though.
What advice would you give someone trying to get into broadcast journalism?
Into what journalism? Into broadcast journalism. The advice is prepare to be poor, or continue to be poor. That would be a better one. Drink less, smoke less, whatever it is. Not whatever substance it is, but anyway, you know what I mean. And continue to be poor, but as whatever work experience, whatever internships, whatever you can get, even if they're free and exploitative, the issue is that A, you will have an opportunity to do something which sets you apart. I'm thinking of a student who was here last year, who's been with us this summer. She was exceptional. I mean, a really real self-starter, somebody who came up with stories. And though we couldn't employ her, today she's working in STV. So it's possible, but it's very hard. But if you want to do it, you will do it. This is one of the few trades in life that if you want to do it enough, you'll do it and you'll enjoy it and you'll get there. It's a fantastic life if you can make it. And you will make it if you want to make it. But it does require sacrifice. Hacking is not the greatest way to sustain a relationship. Unless you have another hack that you go on round with, and then you'll fall out with each other over the story, and that's it. So that's what I would do. Yeah, set your heart on it, and use your brain to pursue it. Yeah.
Having been in war zones yourself, do you think journalism is about the art of observation, or are there cases where you should get involved?
Is it about the art of observation, or?
Should you get involved?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was told by my first editor, never be seen holding a baby, touching anybody, just be there. And it's true, that is not bad advice. There are times when it's tempting to be involved, but you should not be involved. You should be the observer, because you're of much more value to the person you'd like to help by observing and reporting than you are. That is, unless you're in an absolutely life-saving situation. I'll give you one interesting example. I was sent to New Orleans for the terrible Hurricane Katrina disaster, one of the worst urban disasters I've been to. As you know, FEMA, which was the federal system for dealing with disasters, completely failed, totally failed. We set off from London upon the first breach in the sea wall in New Orleans, and the flight, you couldn't land in New Orleans. You had to land in Houston, which was a good run away. We left the office, I suppose, an hour after the first breach, caught the plane to Houston, and within about 18 hours we were on the ground entering New Orleans. We had meanwhile got hold of a flat-bottomed, fan-driven boat from Florida and had it driven to New Orleans. So when we arrived, it arrived, and we got in the boat and we started filming. And we very quickly realized there were no boats. Nobody had got any rescue apparatus going. There were helicopters. They were up on everything was 10 foot, 15 feet deep. But the freeways were still up out of the water because they were on stilts. And the helicopters were up on the freeways. And we realized very quickly that what we were seeing was a real humanitarian, complete catastrophe. There were people on rooftops, there were people seriously ill, there were people injured, and there was absolutely no alternative. You just could not go around in your boat seeing these people screaming at you, begging for help, saying, my father has a heart condition, he's 82, he's going to die, he hasn't had his medicine, said, you can't do nothing. And under those circumstances, I must admit that we started taking people on board. We filmed them. I said to the cameraman, I must be excluded from all pictures, but of course we had to help bodily carry people into the boat. And then we took the boat to the slipway up to the freeway, and we sent the people up on stretchers to the helicopters and away. I mean, there were other people beginning to do the same thing, but you couldn't just stand idly by because there had been a catastrophic institutional failure in providing any rescue. But that's the only time I can actually think that I've breached my own rules. And we were able to sort of do a piece which didn't make us look like heroic kind of, lifesavers. But generally speaking, you shouldn't. Yes. I think I've had you before. No, first time, right.
T, what has been the hardest lesson learned, or perhaps the most valuable lesson learned throughout your career?
The hardest lesson and the most valuable lesson? That's a good philosophical question. The hardest lesson is, I think, to remain rooted, to remain who you are, and not allow yourself to be distanced by the job that you do. You remain who you are. You remain the person who cries. You remain the person who laughs. You remain the person who makes naughty jokes. You remain the person who feels passionately about particular issues. And you offset your feelings against what you have to do, which is to take a dispassionate view of what you're doing. We're never going to be neutral, and I said that before. But we can be objective. We can try to be objective, and we need to be objective as much as we can. But we have passionate views. We are political animals. We feel things. But we mustn't forget who we are. And it's very easy in television, particularly, to forget who you are. People come bounding up to you and they say, oh, I do like your work. And you think, isn't that great? But it isn't, That's why I ride a bicycle. That really does keep you rooted. People shout at you, why are you going through that? Red light, that's a red light. And all the rest of it, or they knock you off, or they, and the rest of it. It's good because you suffer with the rest. Cycling is now a mass indulgence of suffering. And it's good to suffer, because one day we'll win. One day people will realize that cycling is a very, very good idea and could save the planet. But I mustn't say that. I mustn't say that because I'm completely objective about all transport matters. I like big gas-guzzling cars, all that. I don't actually, but there it is. I'm prepared to accept that people do. But that's the hardest. And what was the other question? Most valuable. Well, maybe they combine together, Maybe they're both rather important. Maybe they are the same answer. Most valuable. Well, that's the other thing. You can't forget that the people closest to you are still the most important people in your life, even though you may grieve for the people that you're trying to report about. Yes?
You said earlier that you don't have any regrets at all. Is there any stories that you covered that you got wrong, or you wish you could read it?
Well, I'm afraid, gosh, I see that we're kind of running out of time. But I did have a terrible, terrible experience as a cub reporter. I was sent to Spain, and there had been the most terrible, devastating accident in which a liquid gas tanker had exploded at a campsite. It had been delivering gas for people's cooking stoves, and it was on the sea. And I got there before my cameraman, who was a loathsome man from Madrid, who I think had been Franco's cameraman or something like that. And in some way we thought it was a good idea to hire him. It was the worst idea imaginable. But anyway, he was late, and I got there early. And I met this amazing Dutch eyewitness, and he said, it was terrible, you know, what happened. The gas went all over the tents, and the people ran into the sea, and they came out, and the flesh was falling from their bones. I thought, fuck, this is so good. You know, we must use this. But I haven't got a camera. And then my cameraman turned up, and an hour later I sought the old Dutchman out, and I said, you know, could you give me an interview? Now I've got a camera, and he started very painfully slow and a boring account of what happened. And I found myself saying, in my head, I thought, well, they'll edit this out. That'll be all right. Could you see their bones? You know, I wanted to provoke him to talk about this business of them coming out of the sea, and the deadline was very tight, and we fed the stuff back to London, and unfortunately they left it in, and I looked terrible, absolutely ghastly, inhuman, insensitive bastard. Right, a couple of quickies, any more? Yes?
Where do you find your amazing selection of ties and corresponding socks?
Oh, well, I have one particular tie maker who exports to Japan, so not many of them end up here. And I found her because very early on, Paul Smith did very nice ties, but they were a phenomenal price, as they are now. I mean, you couldn't hope to adorn yourself in more than one, and that would cost you half a week's salary or whatever, or half a month's salary. So I managed to find out who made the tie, and I caught up with her, and she's been a real good supplier ever since. But I'm mainly looking craft shows and the rest of it. I can't understand. I mean, the tie is a very odd thing. I mean, it is an odd thing. I mean, I only wear it because, you know, I'd probably have a scrawny turkey neck if I didn't have it. But the tie is a very odd thing, and I can't understand anybody who gets up in the morning and pulls some awful sort of tawdry brown or black or dark maroon or dark blue horror and ties it on. I mean, how do we express ourselves? I mean, this is great. This is rebellion, basically. These are rebellion. I mean, you know, rebellion. There must be rebellion in all of us. If you can express it in your socks and your tie, you're halfway there. Yes?
What other reporters do you respect most?
Well, there was a guy called Charles Wheeler, who's unfortunately now not with us. I've respected him enormously. Bill Neely on ITV, I'm a big fan of in terms of broadcaster. But there are so many, it would be invidious, and the people you don't mention will have it in view. And you had a question.
Has there ever been a time where you've questioned the morality of journalism?
Oh, yes. Yeah, every day. Every day. And I think it's because we question the morality of journalism that we're where we are at the moment, which is awaiting the edict of Lord Justice Leveson. I think, you know, appallingly immoral activity has gone on in the British press. And I think that one of the reasons why people are reluctant to enter public life in this country is because of our media. I don't know a media anywhere in the world which does quite what our media does. And yet, you can still be Cyril Smith and survive. Amazing. And die unmolested, having molested so many others. Amazing, amazing. Strange stuff. Very strange. I think Thursday's going to be a very interesting day. Very interesting day. That's the day it comes out. Do you think I've had it? Have I run into the buffers?
Anything your trade. Yeah, we better leave it there because it could go on for ages.
Anybody got a desperate question they need to ask? Anybody, the last question? No? You've got one.
Okay.
Oh, you asked the most difficult question in the beginning, and you're not going to end with the most difficult question in the end.
If you have unprecedented access to high-profile sources in comparison to other journalists, and they tell you something off the record that's quite surprising, do you then risk that relationship by reporting it, or?
That's the issue. That's the issue. If somebody tells you something really explosive, and they're a great, good, high-level source, and you think is it really so important that you're prepared to blow the relationship for future things? I think, ultimately, people only ever tell you anything because they actually do want it out. You know, I think that has to be the judgment. And I will perhaps do a bit of it and see whether he still takes my phone call or she still takes my phone call, and then I'll do the rest. I don't know. It's a judgment you have to make. Look, we're psychiatrists and psychologists as well as hacks. We have to read the human spirit and the human mind. You know, it's a complex business. You know, we're the most eclectic people that have ever lived. We are exaggerated humans, and we're going to have a very good life. Good luck.
Thank you very much, John.